Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm just going to be doing a fun short little video because I've been thinking a lot about books that people dislike. So I've been thinking a lot about rant reviews and kind of dumping on books, which is, I don't want to never say never, but I don't feel like that is something that you will likely see from this channel for a couple of different reasons. So I don't like doing that. It makes me feel bad. So not that I think that there's going to be a ton of authors who are keeping up on my channel or watching my channel, but I don't like the idea that I would read something and then totally trash it and have it out there available in the world for somebody who put a lot of time and a lot of effort into something and then created it and were probably proud of it and then have to go and watch me kind of crap all over it. Now, I think that you should definitely be honest. If I don't like something, then I will be very clear that I don't like it. I will be happy to outline the reasons that I don't like it. It's more when that there's that kind of air of like vindictiveness or almost pleasure out of ripping something to shreds, which I know can be very therapeutic and people tend to enjoy that and people really like watching it too. But I don't get that same experience. It just makes me feel sad and bad. Like, for example, in the same vein that like my husband loves to watch blooper videos, like people falling down or hurting themselves, and he thinks they're really funny. But I have a really hard time with that because I'm like, oh my God, are they okay? Are they hurt? What happened afterwards? I have a hard time with that. So I personally have a hard time with the kind of ripping down of things and especially of books. And then also, on the other hand, it takes a lot for me to hate something. It takes a lot for me to love, like for something to become one of my favorite things of all time, because I tend to like most things. I have a wide range of reading tastes. I enjoy a wide range of tropes. I like lots of different things about books. I like characters. I like prose. I like romance. I like there are lots of different things that I really enjoy. So if a book has one of them, but not some of the others, then I can usually find something in there that is enjoyable. So I can think of maybe one or two books in my life that I have read that I have absolutely detested and then gone to write like scathing reviews of on Goodreads just because there was something in there that I felt was reprehensible. And I needed to communicate this to other people, but it has not been often or for very many things. So I don't get that same really intense burning hatred for certain books that people seem to get. So when I watch videos and I see the same books kind of coming up over and over and over that people really detest, I usually have read them and at least enjoyed them a little bit. So I'm going to talk about 5 books today that I see trashed kind of unanimously. People really seem to hate these books. These are the fantasy books that people would, rather set themselves on fire than read. There are some fantasy books that people also seem to think are really bad that I have not read, so I will not touch on those today. But these are the 5 that I have read that I see a lot of hatred for online. And I just want to talk a little bit about them, when I read them, if I enjoyed them, do I think that I would enjoy them to the same degree now? And we will start with the book that I read the earliest on this list, and that is The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. So you can find this book on lots of lists of worst fantasy ever written. And this is a book that I really liked when I was younger. So I've talked about my love of The Lord of the Rings on the channel. And so I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 10. And after that, I wanted to have other things that were Lord of the Rings. So almost immediately after finishing that series, my dad gave me this first Shannara trilogy. And so The Sword of Shannara, for anyone who hasn't read it, is very heavily influenced by The Lord of the Rings, we will say. Many of the plot points, many of the characters, many of the things that happen are definitely they take heavy inspiration from what happens in The Lord of the Rings. However, when I read this, I was a kid who had just read and loved Lord of the Rings, and all I wanted was more Lord of the Rings. That was what I wanted to get. That was, I didn't want to say goodbye. I loved that experience so much that all I wanted to read was more of the same thing. And so when I read The Sword of Shannara, I got more of the same thing, and I really enjoyed it. I went on to read, and I don't remember, I definitely have looked this up before. I don't remember how many Shannara books there are, but I went on to read, a lot of them. I probably the last like 6 to 8 books maybe are the ones that I have not read. But I have a lot of really good memories about reading through the world of Shannara. I still think that I would probably enjoy the urban fantasy trilogy that is linked to the Shannara books, which is called The Night and the Word, or The Word and the Void. I don't remember actually now. A Night of the Word, maybe. They're urban fantasy books that has like a wizard type character, and the main protagonist is a young girl named Nest. So I really liked those books when they came out, and I think I would still enjoy those now. I don't know how much enjoyment I would get out of reading The Sword of Shannara, and if I had picked it up right now at age 33, after having read tons of fantasy, then, probably I wouldn't like it. Maybe I would even think it was really bad. But I do think that there is a lot of nostalgia in these books that came out in the 70s that were highly influenced by the Lord of the Rings. And I still think that this is a great jumping off point for young people who want to get into fantasy. People who haven't had the time to experience those tropes. This is a really accessible writing style. It still has that kind of good versus evil setup and construct that is I think a good entry point for younger kids who want to experience some of that heroism of fantasy and get involved in the genre. Is it derivative? Probably. I know Terry Brooks even likes to recycle some of his own plot lines, and you will see some of that circularity coming up throughout the series. But there's a reason that this went on and sold so many books for so long. It is easy to read. The plots are compelling. I think that Terry Brooks does a good job of putting together a story. This will not be will not go down in time as one of my favorite fantasy novels. It does borrow heavy inspiration from its predecessors, but I still think that is a pretty good entry point to fantasy, and maybe doesn't deserve quite the dumping that it tends to get online. Following up from that is another kind of classic fantasy series, and that is the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. So I had actually been hoping to reread this trilogy this year. I had joined up in a buddy read with a bunch of my friends, and unfortunately, because of personal circumstances, I fell behind on the buddy read and then was not able to catch up. So I have not reread any of these books. But again, the Dragonlance books are books that tend to get really heavily dumped on online. These are works of classic fantasy. They are kind of, D&D campaigns in novelized form. Of the Dragonlance books, I have read these, the original Chronicles. I have read, I think it's called Legends, the ones about the brothers, Raistlin and Caramon. I have read those books, and a couple of the other books that take place around the same time period. So I am not incredibly well read in the world of Dragonlance. I have only read between, I would say 8 and 10 books. I couldn't say for certain unless I went back and kind of scoured through Goodreads, but I haven't read a ton of them, though I do have good memories of reading this. Again, very tropey fantasy, but from what I remember, it was exactly what I wanted when I got it. I read this as, I think around age 12 or 13 probably, and again, not having had a ton of experience in fantasy, I thought it was great. I thought it was a great adventure. I remember really enjoying the characters. Again, I wonder if it deserves all of the negative feelings, all the animosity that comes toward it. I don't remember a ton about the writing style. I just have my own nostalgia, I guess, that I can lean on. But I think that these really tropey fantasy stories are great jumping off points for young readers. This totally sucked me in. This was exactly the story that I wanted when I read it. So I think some of reading fantasy has to be perspective. And I think you would get some people who would argue that a good book is a good book and it should stand up whether you read it when you're 12 or when you're 22 or when you're 52. And you are entitled to that opinion. But I think that there are some books that come to you at the right time. And I think that there are some books that are more appropriate when you're younger and when you're less experienced, and some that work better when you have that wealth of experience and you want to dig a little deeper. All books are not created equally. All authors have different strengths. And I think that there are things to be found and to be celebrated in these early fantasy series that I think are still worthwhile today. These are definitely books, the Dragonlance books, the Shannara books. If my kids are interested at all in fantasy, these are definitely going to be some of the first adult fantasy books that I push into their hands. I know that there's a wealth of YA fantasy to fall back on now, but I also think that it is important to introduce them to some of these classics and let them see the tropes used in a slightly more adult setting with a slightly different focus, not getting totally captured by the romance or those elements that tend to shine through really strongly in the YA sphere. So I can't really give an up-to-date opinion on Dragonlance because it's been so long since I read them, but I don't know. Do you guys think that this deserves the absolute hit that it takes online in terms of quality? For anyone who's reread it recently or read it for the first time recently, how did you feel about it? Coming up next, we have the almost unanimously despised Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. I never remember how much of my shelves actually show up in these videos, but the Richard books, I don't know what the actual series is called, is the Sword of Truth, sorry. So the Sword of Truth books are all up on the top shelf. I have read them all. I have reread several of them. And I have to say that when I first read these books, I really liked them. I have reread Wizard's First Rule a couple of times, and I have always enjoyed it. So this is a book that takes a lot of hate, and I think that there are a couple of different reasons for that. I think people do find the plot to be predictable and somewhat derivative. I have heard that there's some similarities to The Wheel of Time. I haven't read The Wheel of Time, so if you have read that and this, then you could let me know if that's true. I think that as the series goes on, the author's personal beliefs and personal philosophies about life bleed into the pages. And so it starts to feel like some sort of wish fulfillment. The author is putting themselves not as a character. I don't necessarily know, obviously nobody knows, but I don't know how much Terry Goodkind saw himself as Richard, the main protagonist of the series, but definitely his own personal beliefs and philosophies did make their way onto the page. And that's not always a terrible thing. We are who we are, and those beliefs, values, likes, dislikes are going to bleed into the art that we create in subtle or overt ways, depending on the medium, depending on the person. But I think there's very little nuance in terms of what Terry Goodkind had injected into the Sword of Truth. And even as someone who overall liked the series, I think that that's something that you have to be willing to admit. That being said, I think that that's much less prominent in the first book. And I do wonder if retrospectively people start to enjoy the series less and less, and then kind of look back and think on all of it as being really bad. Now, that being said, you are welcome to hate this book. Lots of people probably do just think it's bad. I just don't think that this first volume is as bad as everybody says it is. Granted, again, I read this when I was 14 or 15. I was a little bit of an older teenager when I read this, but I remember really enjoying it. I reread it, I would say probably back in 2009 or 2010. I got my husband to read it when we were vacationing in France in 2011, and he read it in 2 days. This is a very fast-paced book. It's very easy to flip through, even for people who don't read a lot. My husband really likes fantasy, but he doesn't read as much as I do. And again, it took him 2 days to get through this big chunky book. So I think that it is a pretty compelling story. It keeps you wanting to read. It keeps you going. And I, in the beginning, was very invested in the main characters here. I don't know if I went back and reread it, if that would necessarily still be the case, but I think that this series changes a lot as it goes on, and maybe that those changes reflect how people think of it as a whole. I also know that there were some kind of controversial statements made by Terry Goodkind. I don't know that much about them. I haven't read a whole lot, but as I understand, he said some not so nice things about Robert Jordan during a time in his life when he was really unwell. And I think that that also has made people kind of reflect on, it has kind of colored people's impressions of the novels as a whole. So while this might not be a series that I am kind of putting at, on my favorite series list or recommending to everyone, I do think that the first book is at least worth a look. I did enjoy it when I read it. I think it's a very fast-paced fantasy novel if you want to read something, and it has a satisfying conclusion. You don't need to continue on with the rest of the series, but I am curious of the people who have read this, who really hates it. Do you hate it for any of the reasons that I talked about, or do you just think that it's plain bad? Did you actually enjoy it? I don't know. I liked it back when I read it. I wouldn't mind rereading it again just to see how I feel about it now. But it is one that at the time I did get a lot of enjoyment out of. The next couple are actually YA fantasy that tend to get dumbed down a lot. The first of which is Aragon by Christopher Paolini. So I think Aragon came out, I'm gonna say like around 2002 or 3. Yeah. So I was a teenager when Aragon came out, and I really liked this series. This is one of the first fantasy series that I read to and with my youngest sister. And as far as I know, it's still one of her favorite series. I would have to check in with her to see, but I think it remains one of her favorite fantasy series. And I have a lot of positive memories associated with it because it was something that we read at the same time. My youngest sister doesn't tend to read a whole lot of novels. She reads a lot of manga. She watches a lot of anime. She's kind of my go-to person when I'm looking for those types of recommendations. But she does like fantasy novels, and every now and then I'll kind of push one in her direction and try to get her to read it. For Aragon, I think there's a couple of reasons why people tend not to like this. For anyone who didn't know, Christopher Paolini's parents work in publishing, and so he was really interested in writing and kind of had the connections and the means to be able to write a book and have people within the industry help him market it and kind of get it out there on a global scale. And he wrote Aragon when he was quite young. I think he's like a year or two older than I am. And I think he was a young to middling teenager when Aragon was released. And so I think that the influences that he had, which include The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, feature very heavily in these novels. The influences are very clear when you read this book. And the writing is, I don't think it's horrible. Like, I have definitely read books that have worse writing. But it is simple. It is very straightforward. And I think that those are a couple of the things that people tend not to like about this book. It is a young adult coming-of-age fantasy novel. It uses a lot of very common tropes. And like I said, you can really see the Lord of the Rings and especially the Star Wars influences when you read this. That being said, I still really enjoyed it. I like animal companions, so this is about a young boy who finds a dragon egg and hatches a dragon from it. I like stories about dragons. I like those two things. I like Lord of the Rings and I like Star Wars. And as I said, not everything that I read needs to be highly thematic, needs to be beautiful prose, needs to be kind of the most subtle, nuanced, original take on fantasy. I like all those things. I'm glad that we're getting more of those things as fantasy continues to evolve, continues to diversify. But I also like those really straightforward stories. I really enjoyed Aragon. I read the whole series. I think I have read it twice, but I'm not 100% sure. It brings back a lot of good memories for me, and I would happily read it with my kids. So it's definitely one of the book series that I will read with them probably in a couple of years as their attention span increases and they can handle a little bit more violence. But I absolutely do not think that it deserves the trashing that it gets online. Is it going to be for everyone? No. But I don't think it's that bad. I would like to know what your feelings are, if you feel like it is that entirely horrible. And the last book is probably the one that gets crapped on the most ever, not just in terms of fantasy, but just in terms of book. Like if you ask people for the worst book ever written, lots of people would probably say this one. And this, my copy, does not even have a cover because that is how many times I have read it. It has a spine though. So that is Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I talked about this when I did my bookshelf tour. I read Twilight for the first time. Twilight being a paranormal romance centered around a mortal girl and a vampire named Edward who sparkles. It has spawned many a pop culture meme. It has been spoofed, made fun of. Has it become ubiquitous in popular culture? Everybody knows what you're talking about when you're talking about Twilight. And I read this when I was in my late teens. I think I was 19 when I read this for the first time. And I had been unceremoniously dumped. So I had come home, I had spent a semester abroad, had a great time, had come home for the summer, had not seen any of my family, but my mom picked me up at the airport, drove me to the town where my boyfriend at the time lived, then drove away, like drove home, the 2 hours home. And when I got to this boy's house, he broke up with me like 5 minutes after I walked in the door. So I had to sit outside on the porch crying while I waited for my mom to get to a place where there was cell phone service because we live in the middle of nowhere, where I could call her and ask her to drive back and pick me up and bring me back home. So it was, I laugh now, but looking back, it was a very painful day. And how I got through that very painful time was by reading this young adult vampire romance. It was the book that I needed at that time. So Twilight is absolutely a tropey, over-the-top, pretty unhealthy romance. And it spawned a huge fandom, hordes of especially young girls, but I think that there are other people who read this book as well and enjoyed it. It gave them something that they were looking for and kind of created this boom in young adult publishing in the YA world that I think is overlooked when people talk about Twilight. So Twilight had a huge cultural impact. Whether or not you look at it, you read it, whether you think it is absolute garbage, trash, the worst thing ever written, you cannot take away what Twilight did for young adult publishing. There was YA before Twilight. There will be YA long after Twilight disappears. But it opened up that niche for a lot of people to get in there. And we have gotten lots of bad YA books, but we have gotten lots of phenomenal YA books. And I wonder how that industry would have progressed without the influence of Twilight. But at the time when I read this, like I said, I was sad, and I spent a lot of time that summer like taking like very dramatic walks and eating a lot of ice cream and reading Twilight like next to the lake and feeling like so sad, but also like I wanted an Edward Cullen to come and, you know, make me feel happy. So was it the worst way to cope? I don't think so. I think I have seen a lot of unhealthy coping over the course of my career. And I think if to deal with your sadness, you're going to read a book that maybe has a kind of creepy, unrealistic romance at its core, as long as you can recognize those things, then I don't think that there's anything wrong with getting enjoyment out of that. I can acknowledge that the writing in Twilight leaves much to be desired. I can acknowledge that the entire premise of being immortal and redoing high school over and over and over is questionable. However, I will let this book speak for itself. I read it so much the covers fell off. I bought other copies of it. I watched the first movie when it came out in theaters 4 times. Like, I was totally sucked in by Twilight. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. I could talk about Twilight for a long time. I'm not going to tell you that it is the best thing ever written, but I think that it gave us a novel that focused on like young female sexuality, that focused on a young woman who put her romantic desires kind of ahead of other things. And again, it's not that I'm making the argument that the main character Bella makes great decisions. She totally lets her life become enveloped by this boy, which is not healthy. And there are lots of other things that you can do and that you can love and that you can be happy about. But to have a book that so unabashedly embraced those really intense adolescent, early adult feelings as you navigate those first romances, I don't think that that's something that was done to that same degree, and certainly not something that took off to the same degree that Twilight did. So I think Twilight has its place in the YA canon. I am certainly happy that I read it at the time of my life when I did. If I read it for the first time right now, I would probably be like, oh dear, and just set it aside and not pick it up anymore. But it came to me at the right time. And certain books do that. You know, there are books that you would read at certain points in your life that you would feel absolutely, totally differently about if you read them a decade before or a decade afterward. But again, I think that Twilight maybe deserves some of the criticisms that it receives, but I don't think we should overlook the positive impact or the fact that it did mean a lot to a lot of readers at the time when it came out. But those are my kind of fantasy dumping grounds books. Those are the books that I see being raked over the coals all over the internet, whether it's on BookTube or in forums on Reddit or in, worst books lists, all those types of things. Are there any books that you feel like get an unfair rap? Are there any books that you wish that you hadn't read? Books that you wish you could erase from your memory? I would love to hear about it. Again, I don't think this is going to be the place where you'll see a lot of rant reviews, but I do like paying attention to the types of things that people seem to hate and seeing how different readers reflect on those things. So would love to hear from you. Hopefully you found this enjoyable, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye.